Hey there, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this CBC Ask Live. We are taking your questions today about the federal budget. We want to hear from as many of you as we can, get through as many questions as we can. If you are watching us on YouTube or TikTok, you can leave a question in the live chat. If you're watching elsewhere, you can email us your questions at ask@cbc.ca. I am Catherine Cullen. I'm host of CBC's The House. You can find it on CBC Radio or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm also a senior reporter in the Parliament Hill Bureau.
And I'm JP Tasker. I'm a senior reporter here in the Parliamentary Bureau as well.
So, JP, big week for political nerds like us, busy with the budget. I want to know, we're going to get into all the questions, but top line, what was your takeaway from this budget?
Yeah, this budget really presents a gloomy picture of the Canadian economy, frankly. Unemployment is up, business confidence is down, exports have really plummeted. And it's designed to try and turn things around, to splash some cash around to make major investments in the military, in infrastructure, in housing, a bunch of different sectors that the government wants to make a priority to try and put people to work as the country's grappling with that U.S. trade war. We got some details as to just how damaging that trade war has been to this point. I mean, the economy was expected to grow 2% this year. Now it's down to 1%. That might not sound like a lot. That's a $24 billion hit to the Canadian economy, and a large part of it is driven by Trump. And so Mark Carney and his government presenting their first budget, lots of solutions in there, they think, to try and make this situation a little more palatable for people who are facing job loss, who are facing economic downturn, who are facing tariffs that are really punishing on some businesses.
And a lot of the questions we've already gotten are about what this budget means for individuals. We're going to dive into that in a second, but I do think we don't want to get lost in the numbers, but there are some top line numbers that kind of help us make sense of what this budget means. Can you hit us with some of the most important ones?
Yeah, I mean, there was some talk ahead of this budget that it might be an austerity budget, that there would be huge cuts and that Mark Carney wouldn't, open up the purse strings and spend too much. That is not the case. There's $141 billion in new spending over the next little while that's in this budget, but there are some cuts. There are some savings being booked, about $51 billion to offset that huge pile of cash that will be going out the door. And we're looking at a deficit of about $78 billion for this fiscal year, so definitely higher than it's been in years past. Not quite as high as it was during COVID, but it's not a small figure. The government's justifying that, saying that they need to make major investments. This is a time for generational investment, as they say. We can't sit back and follow a path where the government is not spending money juicing the economy. They feel like they need to kind of splash some cash around, and make some investments to try and make things a little more, tolerable for people who are really grappling with some hard issues right now.
You raised that word austerity, and it's interesting because some of the public sector unions, some of the unions out there are still seizing on this and suggesting there is austerity in this budget because there are these cuts to government spending, which brings us to the politics of this. We're going to get to one of the first questions. John, who emailed at ask@cbc.ca. When do they actually vote on the budget? Has it passed? A lot of people want to know about the timelines here.
Yeah, for sure. So the budget vote will actually come quite quickly. Some things in this town are really slow, not when it comes to voting on a budget, at least the initial vote. So the parliamentary tradition is that there are 4 sitting days of debate on the budget, and then MPs are asked to vote in general terms whether they approve of it, right? So they're not going line by line over the next number of weeks, but they just in general are asked if they're going to go along with what the government has laid out this week. So, this is a chance for the MPs, the opposition parties, to kind of beat up on the government, to present some amendments, possible sub-amendments where they'd like to see some changes. Generally, this passes through, and then you get to a few weeks on, and they go line by line. They do a Budget Implementation Act, and they will look at every different department and every different agency and approve some of the different funding packages there. But our first opportunity for a confidence vote, which is when we will find out if this government will survive, because any vote on a budget is considered a confidence vote, and if they don't pass that budget as expected, then we could be headed for an election. And you know what? The government doesn't have the votes right now.
It is a minority government, and they may just have brought an MP over from the Conservative Party, but they are still, be it 2 votes shy of getting their budget passed, or the possibility of perhaps a couple of MPs just sitting this out, and we still don't know what's going to happen on that front.
Right. We've done some reporting. Obviously, the Conservatives are dead set against this budget, Catherine. Pierre Poilievre came out, within minutes, frankly, of this budget being tabled in the House of Commons. Obviously, they had seen it before it was made public, but he came out within minutes to say that the Conservative Party cannot support this budget. They will not be supporting it because it did include some of the asks that they had, like a much smaller deficit, getting rid of the industrial carbon tax. We've also heard from the Bloc Québécois, they are not going to be voting for this budget either. They wanted a lot more spending for Quebec, for seniors, for first-time homebuyers, a bunch of things that were not included in this budget, so they're out. The NDP, that's where things get a little interesting, because what is this small 7-member caucus going to do when they have to come to a decision? We haven't got a firm answer from them yet, right? Because they want to take time to review it, and there's the possibility of abstaining on the vote, which would be quite a development.
And another thing that's really interesting about that is some of the stuff that's baked into this budget. They are explicit priorities of some of those NDP members. So imagine you're looking at this budget. It says that you're going to get a community centre in your riding that maybe you've been campaigning for, or I know one NDP MP who has been campaigning for more a national firefighting plan, more aerial firefighting force, leasing 4 new planes in here. So can you vote against a budget that has measures that you have been wanting for years? It is going to be a really tricky situation for the NDP, and we don't know if they're going to be more floor crossers. Right. So we're having fun here in Ottawa, but a lot of people want to know about what this budget means for them. Before we get into the individual, groups, seniors, students, Sarah emailed ask@cbc.ca. I was wondering how the budget lines up or doesn't with the promises made by the Liberals during the election.
Yeah, it's a good question, because we're always trying to get some accountability on those election platforms. Sometimes they make big promises and don't deliver, as we know. But in this case, I would say the budget generally aligns with what the Liberals promised just 6 months ago in the last federal election campaign. They are following through on an ambitious housing plan. It's not quite as many homes as they said it would be. They were really tracking for, I think it was 500,000 new homes built every year. This budget kind of tamps that down a bit, suggesting it'll be about 430 to 480,000 homes a year. So not a major miss. They're still very much committed to that platform plank. They also made a commitment during the election to spend a lot more on the military. We are seeing that in spades in this budget, nearly $81 billion of new spending for the Canadian Armed Forces. Much of it new money, much of it above and beyond what they even committed to spend earlier this year. That's going to be a huge boost for that sector, a big boost for military personnel. CBC, well, another thing they delivered on. I mean, we don't like to talk about ourselves too much, but they promised $150 million for the CBC, and that's coming through in this budget. There was a promise on high-speed rail in the budget. In the platform. In the budget, there is a commitment to speed up the timelines to get high-speed rail built between Toronto and Quebec City, something that governments for literally decades have been promising. They're trying to come through with that. There is some things where they're falling short. They wanted a lot more money for artificial intelligence in the Liberal platform. That's not in this budget. It's about $1 billion less than they had initially intended. So there are some instances where, it's not quite what they promised voters they would do. But I would say it gets a passing grade. It hews pretty closely to what they had said they would do.
Well, in line with this question of what they promised versus what they're doing, quite a few people emailed ask@cbc.ca wanting to know how the budget will affect seniors. So I want to talk a little bit about what it does and doesn't say about that. I have to admit that, looking at the budget when we were in the budget lockup, which is hours that we spend sort of eating our snacks and digging through the budget before it is actually tabled, so that when the time comes, when the government puts its budget forward, reporters like ourselves can talk with some authority about what's in here and what it means. I didn't come across a lot about seniors, and so I did some research because I knew we were coming up to this question. I think the reason we didn't come across a lot is because there is not a lot in this budget that is new measures that are explicitly aimed at seniors. Interesting to note, though, that during the election campaign, the Liberals promised to reduce the minimum amount that retirees must withdraw from their Registered Retirement Income Fund, so the RRIF, by 25% for 1 year. They also pledged to boost the Guaranteed Income Supplement by 5% for a year. That's an increase that would have provided up to $652 more to low-income seniors. If you're looking for it, JP, it's not in the budget. Neither
Right.
of those measures. It was not, in fact, included. I think one thing that is probably worth considering, and it's not necessarily about line items in the budget or I guess like flashy sections that try to draw in people's attention. Part of the challenge here is that the cost of the benefits to seniors are an enormous part.
That's what I was looking for.
Yes, it's an enormous part of the federal budget. It is actually a kind of, in some ways, unspoken tension when it comes to government spending, because the money that goes to seniors, particularly you're talking about something like GIS, this is low-income seniors. People need this money, but the amount of money just keeps growing and growing, and it outstrips a lot of the other things that we are talking about. It pulls on these questions about generational fairness. So there aren't a lot of obvious goodies, let's say, for seniors in the budget. I think the government would argue that writ large, they're trying to juice the economy, it's going to help everyone. But a lot of the money that is actually being spent is going to senior citizens. So that's interesting.
Yeah, in this budget, it ramps up. The cost of old age security gets to $100 billion a year just in the time frame outlined in this budget. So that's a major line item. I think that's nearly double what they spend on healthcare transfers every year, just to put that in perspective. So seniors definitely, not saying they're not worthy, but it's certainly an expensive item for the government as it is.
Before we get to another group wondering whether or not they can see themselves in this budget, let's take a little break and do some pure raw politics,
Ooh,
JP. It's what you and I love.
My
Heather Baird emailed ask@cbc.ca. And if you're watching at home right now, that's one way that you can send a question into us, ask@cbc.ca. How can an MP who is elected by constituents as a Conservative walk across the floor to join the Liberals?
Yeah, this is always a controversial one, isn't it? But it's part of our parliamentary democracy. I mean, you and I have been on the Hill long enough now to have seen a few of these things, right? It happens. Jenica Atwin left the Green Party, for example.
Adams going over to the Liberals. Yeah.
Leona Alislev left the Liberals to go to the Conservatives, and then she was made the deputy leader under former leader Andrew Scheer. So this does happen fairly regularly, I would say. I mean, it's not like a daily occurrence. It's not a yearly occurrence.
It's always a shock when it happens.
It's always a shock, though, because there aren't that many, you know. But I don't want to make it out to be like, wow, this is a one-time thing. It's never happened before, and it's something nefarious. It happens, but there is always blowback, right? Because Chris d'Entremont has been a lifelong Conservative. The guy who just crossed the floor to join the Liberals this week was a former provincial Progressive Conservative, right? And it's quite a development for him to now join a caucus that he was just campaigning against 6 months ago, and to sit in that Liberal caucus and to say the reason why he's making that move is because he fell out essentially with Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, that he didn't like his leadership style and felt he was too negative. The Liberals were so enthusiastic to welcome him yesterday, as you saw, Catherine. And why are they so enthusiastic to get a new member? I mean, there's the obvious reason. It's just helpful to have somebody else on your team. But it now means there's only 2 votes separating this government from a majority. So the hunt is on, right? Essentially, we heard from Mark Carney yesterday. He's having other conversations with other MPs about potentially becoming other floor crossers. And when you're that close to a majority government, there's stuff's up, right? Things are happening. Conversations are ongoing as the Liberals try and cobble something together to try and keep themselves in power for a little longer.
I want to get to another question in a second, but one thing I will say about that is that the individual MPs also have to make a calculation about whether it's palatable in their riding. They don't want to lose their jobs either. So somebody like Chris d'Entremont, not just a longtime Conservative federally, provincially, longtime Progressive Conservative. He was a cabinet minister at the provincial level, and he won his riding by 1.1% of the votes, just a few hundred votes. So he has obviously made a calculation. Yes, he feels like it's the right thing to do, but also that he can potentially squeak by in the next election. Let's go to some of the live questions that we're being asked right now. Hodo Dalmar on YouTube is asking, does the budget transparently outline how much we will be sending in foreign aid? I will say, you know, one of the interesting things about this budget, Mark Carney talked in the lead up about making sacrifices, and indeed there are cutbacks to various government departments. I don't have the number at my fingertips, but I can tell you one of the things it does say in the budget is that when it comes to funding for global health, for instance, the government explicitly says Canada is giving more money, disproportionate to their counterparts in the rest of the world, or our counterparts, I suppose, in the rest of the world. And so they are going to pull back on global health spending. And I do think this is really interesting because you look at what happened in the US, USAID, pulling back in so much of the world has had enormous consequences. You look at the UK, where they explicitly said, in order to fund our military more, we are going to cut back on foreign aid. Canada is funding its military more, and it is cutting back on foreign aid. The government has not made this one-to-one connection. Obviously, it is part of a bigger picture where they're trying to pull in government spending. But Canada is going to do less in the world, not certainly on things like global health. And it's not to say all the money is gone, but there is a pulling back, and they are trying to, in their view, align with what other countries are doing right now.
Totally, and it's actually a fairly sizable cut to foreign aid. It's $2.7 billion over the next 4 years, so that's not nothing. I mean, they are trying to justify it by saying it's going back to pre-pandemic levels, but don't forget that the economy has grown since then, right? The size of government has grown since then, so it is an outright cut. And it's also funny, you and I know this well, Catherine, that it is also something that Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has been asking for a long time.
Well, with very specific
he
language.
wants much more deeper cuts, I would say, too.
Well, no money for dictators, bureaucracies, there's terrorist organizations.
That's right.
Yes.
But it is interesting that, Mark Carney has picked up on that a little bit. I mean, it's certainly not as deep as Pierre Poilievre has proposed, but it's interesting that around the Western world, this is one area where governments are turning to cut right now, feeling that they will not face a major blowback among the voting population here if they cut foreign aid. They feel like it's kind of an easy one if they have to. Dial things back.
It's truly, it really is a moment. Lauren Drake on YouTube is asking, what is there to know for people with disabilities in the budget? And I do want to talk quickly about the Canada Disabilities Benefit. Now, this is something that the Liberals had promised for some time. Initially, they were pitching the Disabilities Benefit as something that was going to be an absolute sea change, helping people who are living with disabilities get above the poverty line. The amount ultimately delivered by the Canada Disabilities Benefit is not, as to borrow a word from the Liberals, transformational, as perhaps initially pitched, but that has gone into force. One thing that's in the budget is they have laid out measures to improve access to the disability benefit, because this has been a complaint that it's too hard to access. People who are struggling to get by don't necessarily have extra money for getting the doctor's note required, for instance. So to streamline the process to access the benefit, the budget says the federal government is committed to offsetting the cost for applicants to obtain the required disability tax credits. There's more than $100 million over 4 years to try to make that easier for people to access. JP, let's talk. You want to talk about home buyers? You want to talk about students? What are you in the mood for, my friend?
We can talk about home buyers.
Okay, this 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 Sophie on TikTok is asking, is it looking good for first-time home buyers? Sophie would like to know specifically in Vancouver. I don't know. I don't know if you
Let
got
me tell
that
you
number in front
all
of you.
about it. Yes, the West End real estate market is looking good.
But housing is a big part of this budget, and there are previously announced measures that affect first-time home buyers.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the largest line items in here, $14 billion, I believe. You can fact check me on that if I'm wrong, but I think that's what it was, $14 billion over the next several years, plowing more money into affordable housing. So really what the government's intention here is to just provide more supply to the market. It's not necessarily going to build you a 4-bedroom house in the suburbs and you're going to be much better off, but it's about just adding more homes to the market. So building, purpose-built rental buildings, for example, giving tax incentives to builders to build more of those. We know we've been out of that market for decades, right? Most new home construction in this country has been single-family homes or condominiums that are then rented out by private landlords to folks. There hasn't been a lot of purpose-built rental buildings since really the 80s, early 90s. So they're trying to turn that around, change that up a little bit, get some more of those things available in some of the big cities in this country and smaller markets too, I should say. In hopes that just by adding more and getting more people in homes that will help stabilize prices and maybe even bring down rents in some places where they've really escalated. But there's really only so much the government can do, frankly. I mean, this is a market-driven economy that we live in, right? I mean, the government can help, but a lot of this is dependent on interest rates. If interest rates do come back down to earth from where they were, you're going to see more builders build, and that's going to help with supply. But a lot of this is not a short-term fix, and it's really It's tough for people out there, I know, and there's already existing programs from the last government. I don't know how well they're working. Some people say they're working quite well. That first-time home buyers savings account, quite a lucrative program.
Although you have to have the extra
But you got to have the
money,
extra money, and we'll see how that works out. But
you mentioned Build Canada Homes, $13 billion.
13.
So close. I mean, although, what's a billion between friends? But I do want to also talk about another measure that is, it's part of the budget insofar as the spending is in here, but it was previously announced by the government for first-time home buyers. The government eliminating the goods and services tax on new homes up to $1 million and reducing the GST for first-time home buyers on new homes between $1 million and $1.5 million. Now, all the caveats in there matter, right? First-time home buyer, new homes. There are a lot of folks who would like to see the government go further in any number of ways. Don't just make it first-time home buyers. Don't just make it new homes. You do that, costs more money, right?
Huge.
And that is one of the big challenges that the government is facing here, is that there are so many different directions it's being pulled in terms of spending, while at the same time trying to reduce parts of its spending. And so they have decided to, I think this is actually a little bit more generous than they had initially talked about during the election campaign, but there's no sense right now that they're willing to move beyond that.
No. I mean, it's still a big budget line item to do something like that. Pierre Poilievre has pitched doing away with it entirely, right? For all homes under a certain dollar figure, to your point about don't just make it for first-time home buyers, because there's other people out there who already own a home who are also struggling with affordability if they want to move on. That hasn't been addressed in this budget.
Okay, a couple good questions here. One about healthcare and one about this sort of big bucket of productivity money. So let's start with healthcare. An emailer is asking, what's the budget to improve healthcare specifically in the territories? The reason I want to talk about this is because actually a big part of Mark Carney's plan is not about increasing health transfers. There's an escalator. They already go up. That's been established. But there is money that will go potentially into the healthcare system via infrastructure. Tell us about that.
So actually there's this big pool of funds, $51 billion for infrastructure that will be used to build everything from roads, ports, parks, transit, what have you. But there is a big chunk of that money set aside for health infrastructure in particular, because there's a recognition by this government that the population has grown a lot over the last number of years, but the healthcare, not just the people who work in that system, but just the physical infrastructure has not kept up with demand. So there's a lot more money that will be rolled out to build bigger hospitals, to build community healthcare clinics, what have you. That is really interesting. In terms of healthcare as well, I'm really heartened. I've done a lot of stories on foreign credential recognition, especially Canadians that go abroad to do medical school, then struggle to get licensed when they come back to Canada because they don't have medical school spaces for them. There's a lot of money in this budget to work on foreign credential recognition. So you don't have as many Uber drivers who are doctors, for example, or people who do school abroad and stay abroad and can't come back to work in Cape Breton or Outport, Newfoundland, or wherever. That's a really important thing for healthcare, because we know we're facing a major healthcare staffing crunch.
Okay, let's. We could spend the whole rest of the time talking about immigration, but we're getting questions about some other issues. I want to talk about productivity, and then I want to talk about the environment. Butcher Boy on YouTube is asking, I haven't been able to fully understand what $110 billion towards productivity actually means, and I feel like out of everything, it has been the most vague part. Now, sub-question about how much is being spent on AI infrastructure, but let's talk about this super deduction. I'm not sure I'm even getting the term quite right, but basically the government going all in on trying to get businesses to spend more money in this country. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the idea behind that is?
Yeah, that's the other big pool of money in this budget. Essentially what they want to do is that if a business invests in this country, if they buy a new building, if they build a new building, if they buy new equipment, if they buy new technology, if they go all in on artificial intelligence, and that's costly, more businesses will be able to write off more of that spending right away on their taxes. So the government is essentially backstopping businesses if they want to make major investments in this economy. And the whole point of that is that you'll get a cash injection up front from the government that will be a good hit on your taxes, while also making investments, putting people to work. And the whole point of that is to push back against Donald Trump and his big, beautiful bill in the United States, which really lowered taxes, corporate taxes in the US. And so Canada's like, hold on a second, we don't want to lose all these businesses to the US. We got to make ourselves more competitive. We got to make it that corporations are willing to spend their money here at home or attract foreign investment. Don't just go to the US. Hey, Canada, we're open for business. these things have been around before. Businesses have been able to write off, they call it capital cost allowance, that's the term they use for it. There's a hope that this time it will be different, and they're also targeting to certain sectors. Mark Carney's going all in on liquefied natural gas, for one thing. And there's special tax incentives for businesses that invest in LNG, and that's really something that's in demand right now in Asia and Europe, and there's a hope that those tax changes will make it very lucrative for the country.
I do want to just quickly, because the question was also about AI, Budget 2025 provides, it's about $1 billion over 5 years starting next year to support a large-scale sovereign public AI infrastructure that will boost compute availability and support access to sovereign AI compute capacity for public and private research. AI, another big priority certainly for Mark Carney. There have been quite a few questions. I'm just trying to find an example here about Ty Stevenson on YouTube is asking, are there greater details for how to more effectively support the carbon tax and get rid of the emissions cap, how this process will work? You want to run with this one?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
There's not a ton of detail, frankly, in the budget about this, but they are sticking with the industrial carbon price. Pierre Poilievre asked them to scrap it. They're sticking with it. They got rid of the consumer carbon tax. They're sticking with the industrial carbon.
They're not just sticking with it.
They're also boosting it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're actually going to go even further than they had to this point. They kind of want to sit down with the provinces and territories and hash out even maybe strengthening the current system that already exists. And they want to do that because that is really going to be their main climate change policy. That's the centerpiece of the Liberal agenda at this point, because there is talk, if that's strong enough, if they can also make progress on reducing methane emissions, which is a big part of the climate equation, a lot of that comes from oil and gas development. If they can have the industrial carbon tax, the methane emissions, the government is saying, we think we can take a step back from the emissions cap that was proposed by the last government, which is vilified and hated by industry and people, many people in Western Canada, especially Alberta Premier Daniel Smith. So Mark Carney suggesting he's open to some changes on the climate front. He's not quite as doctrinaire, I guess, as the last Prime Minister, in part because he feels like the natural resources sector is a great way to boost the economy right now and get people to work and help with money coming into federal coffers, having more natural resources development. He's on board with that.
What's striking about this, I think, is I feel like there's been this flirtation with moving away from the emissions cap by this government for some time, and cracking open the budget and seeing that the language was still so conditional. A lot of steps. I would say too, if anyone out there happens to have a big interest in carbon pricing, there's actually a lot of content in there about how they want to strengthen the carbon market. We can all, I think, understand, knowing Mark Carney's background, that this is probably something he's very personally invested in, because that's been another big question hanging over all of this. The Mark Carney who wrote the book Values, the Mark Carney who worked for the United Nations on, sustainable financing. How does that Mark Carney square with the Mark Carney who's willing to, or opening the door, keeping the door open to a new oil pipeline? This is their answer. But again, there's still a little bit of to be continued here.
There is tax credits for clean technology development, clean hydrogen. They're still sticking with, or they're proposing even better tax credits for carbon capture and storage for the oil sand sector, so that if we're still going to pump more and more out of the ground, at least we potentially could capture more of the emissions that come out of it to make Canada's oil and gas cleaner than it already is. Like they're not abandoning the climate file. I want to be clear about that, but it's certainly a little bit of a step back, right?
Yes,
it's not as robust as it was under the last Prime Minister.
Yeah, and I believe COP is starting right now in Brazil, and I believe our colleague David Thurton was just letting us know just before we came in here that Environment and Climate Change Canada's briefing repeats Canada's commitment to its climate targets. Officials say they are going to the UN Climate Summit, standing by Canada's 2035 target to reduce emissions by a minimum of 45% below 2005 2005 Those targets are going to be awfully tough to reach.
I don't know how they're going to do it,
but they're standing by some of these targets. Another question, KG on YouTube is asking, what are the risks of Canada's credit rating getting downgraded, and what will those impacts look like? Now, we are not economists, but we've talked to some. And certainly the folks that we have talked to do seem to feel that this is not a significant risk for Canada right now. That yes, there is unquestionably more deficit spending. It is going to add to the debt. This is a significant deficit, $78.3 billion. I mean, outside of wartime and the pandemic, this really stands out as a remarkable number. But every economist I have spoken to has said that this does not suggest that Canada is about to sort of like lose its, frankly, excellent status. You hear over and over again that
AAA credit
G7
rating.
countries would happily change trade places with us.
Yeah, we're not on the precipice, as one economist explained to us, right, Catherine? One person who's a fiscal watcher, he felt, Sahir Khan, I can tell you, I quoted him in my piece. He is a former parliamentary budget officer, very well versed on Canada's finances, and he's spoken to people in the know, and he feels like Canada's credit rating will not be downgraded as a result of this deficit because it actually is on the lower end of what some economists had expected. I interviewed the guy at the National Bank, I'm sorry I'm drawing a blank on his name, really smart fellow, on Power and Politics a few weeks ago. He was expecting a deficit of $100 billion, so $78 billion is a little less, right? And it's
Politics
still
is
a lot.
about expectation management,
Exactly.
right?
It's like, well, at least they can say it wasn't $100 billion. And we do want to keep that AAA credit rating, though, because if we don't, the cost of our debt, to manage that, the public debt financing costs every year will go up a lot. And that means we have less money for everything else that we want. Less money for healthcare, less money for housing, less money for infrastructure. So you have to be fiscally prudent, no question about it. And Mark Carney has said that. Chrystia Freeland before him did too. We got to keep that AAA. And it's not just about the glory or the reputational damage if we lose it. It's that it's really expensive if that credit rating goes down.
I, for one, love basking in the glory of our AAA.
AAA. Us in Germany. I think Germany is right there with us. But there aren't many. There aren't many in that category. It is something to be proud of.
Okay, a few questions about students, but I'm going to indulge us a little bit, JP, and do one more raw politics question. One TikTok user asking, what did the cons do about this budget? Let's talk a little bit about how the Conservatives are reacting.
Well, Pierre Poilievre has said they're voting against it. Don't even bother. Don't count on us for your votes because they feel like they can't support it. They don't like this deficit that we were just talking about. They don't like it at $78 billion. They don't like that the industrial carbon tax is still in place. They had a list of demands that they wanted to see met, and they weren't delivered. And I think this has been said elsewhere. I'll say it again. I can't remember the last time a Conservative Party and their caucus voted for a Liberal budget, right? I think you have to go back at least 20 plus years, maybe back to the Progressive Conservatives. I don't think the merged Conservatives ever have voted for a Liberal budget,
not to
ever.
My memory, but what's interesting about this is it's I think by and large accepted that Mark Carney is, if you were trying to plot this on a spectrum, he's to the right of Justin Trudeau, totally. Right? There's more of a focus on industry, boosting military spending. There are no new social programs. Right. Justin Trudeau laid out a lot of those if we think about childcare, pharmacare in its limited form, which, by the way, is going to continue to exist in its limited form. I think there are deals with 4 provinces and territories for that.
Yep.
So, you can see sort of like ideologically, they're existing in the same territory. Pierre Poilievre, big on getting new energy projects built. That's what Mark Carney talks about, too.
There's a lot of overlap.
But they don't want to do it the same way. Right. And more than that, the political rhetoric, right? I mean, Pierre Poilievre said months ago that he thinks Mark Carney is worse than Justin Trudeau. He has data points that he uses to try to make that point. Once you've said, this is terrible, and this is truly explicitly what Mr. Poilievre is saying, that, single mothers are lining up at food banks and it's the government's fault. I don't know how you then go ahead and support this budget.
Exactly. Yeah, and I mean, he really does feel like all of this new spending fuels inflation too. He's concerned about that, right? Pierre Poilievre, he feels like this is just irresponsible spending and that he just can't stomach it, frankly. I mean, I was at one of his events over the weekend. On Sunday, we were at a food bank, and he said the reason why we're seeing so many more people come to food banks is in part because of government largesse. They've spent too much and they've driven up inflation. I mean, some economists will quibble with some of the facts that he uses, but there is no doubt that government spending is a form of stimulus, right? It does stimulate the economy in some senses.
It depends what else is happening in the economy, the extent to which.
It can be inflationary, though. It can have some inflationary effects, and so that's what Poilievre's point was on that one.
So we will get to students in a second, but in this same vein, someone was just asking, their retro food flashback is asking, what should have been added to the budget to help every Canadian with grocery food prices? I just want to take a beat and acknowledge that certainly the NDP in the past has talked about trying to put more pressure on some of the big grocery corporations, and we know there's a sort of broader public conversation out there about whether you want nationalized grocery stores. That is not something that has has taken root, I guess, here in Ottawa. We hear the word affordability a lot on Parliament Hill. In terms of the specific measures in this budget that make things more affordable for folks, moving beyond grocery prices here, there is that tax cut aimed at the middle class. There's a whole conversation to have about what getting rid of the consumer carbon price meant for affordability, but certainly when it actually involves going to the pump, you're not paying more there. The thing is that all those things have already been announced.
Yes.
And so, even getting rid of the proposed hike on the capital gains, yes, that benefits normally wealthier folks. So there isn't, in terms of new measures that can make things more affordable, there is not a heck of a lot there.
There is on food. I'll just say that they are making the National School Food Program permanent.
Yeah.
Right, so they had funding for a limited period of time. Now the Carney government is making that permanent, and that does help. I think it's about 400,000. Yeah, 400.
How do we
keep these numbers in our head? I
Yeah.
don't know, but we do. 400,000 kids will be fed by this program each and every day. So I mean, there is the argument from the government that that will help with food prices because families don't have to come up with the money to give lunches to their kids, at least during the school day.
Professor Rainstorm on YouTube is one of the many people who have been asking about news in the budget for students. This individual says, I've got younger siblings starting post-secondary soon. There are a few measures aimed directly at students. Canada's Summer Jobs Program could receive almost $600 million over 2 years, starting in 2026-27, if the budget passes. The government says that would support 100,000 summer jobs next year. Right now, the program has created 76,000 jobs, so there's a way that they're sort of trying to juice at least summer employment, and we know this is a real issue. We hear over and over again the youth unemployment levels, young men especially,
really
very
bad.
high. They are also putting money into a student work placement program to support around 55,000 work integrated learning opportunities for post-secondary students. And this is interesting, but it is different than, it deals with students. It's not necessarily about helping them find jobs. They're changing the eligibility for the Canada Student Grant. This matches with one of your favorite issues, JP, which is immigration, which you cover regularly. Now the limited eligibility is only going to be for students attending public educational institutions or not-for-profit private institutions. Basically, you won't have access to this grant if you're an international student at one of these private colleges. We know that's been a really hot discussion, and this is an example of something they say that is going to save the government money, $280 million ongoing.
The cuts to international students is very interesting and will be something that has, frankly, big ramifications for colleges and universities across the country, including the students that go there. They are going to take the number of temporary people in this country, so that includes temporary foreign workers and international students, and they're going to cut it by about half. So it's going down 45% over the next couple of years, going from 673,000 of them down to, I think it was 370,000 temporary residents in this country. So a major cut, and that's down even further from where it was. I mean, in the post-COVID era, there was over 1 million people here on study permits. So a lot of colleges and universities were really counting on international students to pay higher tuition rates, to keep things afloat, and to keep tuition at a sustainable level for other students. And now when they don't have those international students, there might be some rejigging of how tuition is calculated. There will be probably closures. There'll be layoffs from some professors. I'm sure that's coming.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but I am curious, given all the pain felt by so many universities and colleges over this, I was surprised that they decided to go so much further. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I've been talking to people about this, and international students really do put unique pressure on our country, because they put a lot of pressure on the housing market in particular, especially the lower end of the housing market. So they're competing with folks that are already here who are lower income, who want an affordable one-bedroom apartment. There's also pressure on the healthcare system, uniquely from international students. Yeah, because they're transient, right? And they don't have proper healthcare professionals to look after them and their health over the long term. It's kind of like there's a lot of pressure on walk-in clinics. They don't have like normal channels to go through. So there really is a feeling that, like, and I don't know if it's right or not, some experts really do quibble with some of these arguments. Let me point that out. But they feel like it will just take some of the strain and pressure off of some of the systems that have really been overwhelmed by the influx of international students over the last little while.
I do want to say it's something we've talked a lot about on The House, too, wherever you get your podcasts. But some of the folks from universities and colleges have made an argument on the other end, which is that in many cases, what you're talking about is bringing in top talent that is going to help make this country better. Interestingly, a specific focus on the top tier of talent in the budget, which is $1.7 billion that is aimed towards bringing in new people to be like creating new Canada Research Chair positions, so new folks to work at universities, really trying to target essentially some of the top minds in the world and bring them to this country. But you build a different kind of relationship when you bring someone in as an international student. There are decisions and trade-offs being made, is I guess what we could say about that.
Yeah, and you've heard Mark Miller, the former immigration minister. We've heard less from this immigration minister, frankly. I don't think she's really spoken much in public, or certainly on our programs. But Mark Miller, the former immigration minister, said he really wanted to, and the government's continued this policy since then, he wants to crack down on the fraud in international students too. And there's a lot of, we're not necessarily talking about the University of Toronto or Dalhousie or UBC, some of the smaller private colleges where there have been allegations of wrongdoing and
use the term
puppy
mills.
Puppy mills. So when you see these numbers come down, you know, we're not necessarily talking about some of the people that you have just mentioned. You know, it's a different sort of category of schools, and there has been abuse, and maybe some of these numbers are coming down as a result of a crackdown on those institutions.
Well, and it's not necessarily about the people at all. It's not about the students, who often,
in
some cases, they don't know that they think they're coming over here for a good education, and then they find out that there is no education to be had. Angry Bird has one of the biggest questions of all, JP, on TikTok, asking, how is Carney going to pay for this budget?
Well, the government borrows money. You know, just as if we have a credit card or a mortgage or a line of credit, you know, the government gets bondholders to buy its debt, and that helps fuel everything. And what is really interesting is the cost to service that debt, we touched on this a little earlier, has gone up a lot. So, I mean, that's because interest rates have gone up. We have more deficits to roll over into debt and to finance, so it has become more expensive. Luckily, we have that AAA credit rating we were talking about. Luckily, there's a lot of people out there who want to buy Canada's debt because we're a reliable country. We do have a strong economy despite some of the challenges that we're going through. It's not a tough sell to get people to want to take on Canada's debt, right? And that is a good thing. We should be happy about that. But as it gets higher, it does cost us more. More of every dollar that's brought in as tax revenue every year is going to pay for public debt services charges. And it's certainly gone up a lot since 2015 when Trudeau was first
It's gone up significantly since Trudeau. If you expand the time horizon, though, it's not really anything like what we were talking about in the Chrétien Martin years, for instance. So this is the calculation that the Carney government is making. I think part of the answer also, and not just the debt servicing, but is the decision to cut back on government services. Basically, they created two baskets here, right? The capital spending and the operational spending. So the capital stuff we're talking about, you know, the military spending, the spending on housing, the spending on big infrastructure projects. Operational spending, it's basically the functioning of government and the benefits that go along with that. And so the government wants to balance that operational spending basket over the course of the next 3 years, which does also lead to the question of whether or not we're going to see more cuts coming. We know there are cuts coming to the civil service. It is less clear precisely which programs are going to be cut. We talked earlier about, you know, global health money, some cutbacks in Indigenous services, although also some increases in specific baskets. CBC.ca has a great article looking at all the different departmental cuts, but programs, we don't know a lot about the specifics there.
If Carney had just unveiled $141 billion in new spending with no cuts, the market would not be happy. We'd probably be looking at, frankly, some downgrades, potential downgrades to our credit rating if that happened. But yeah, I mean, the details are really, we're looking for more, right? But I can tell you there's a few interesting ones in there. They are cutting the plan to plant 2 billion trees over the next number of years.
They're cutting down 1 billion trees? Is that what you're telling me,
No,
JP?
they're cutting the program to plant 2 billion trees to 1 billion trees. So they've scaled that back a little bit. One other interesting tidbit. I didn't know the government spends so much money on medical marijuana for veterans. It's a huge budget line item.
It's a medical benefit claim that they make.
So they reimburse veterans who buy medical marijuana, who use it for whatever purposes they might. We were paying $8.50 per gram, the government was, to reimburse medical cannabis, which is well above the market rate, I'm told. I don't buy it, I don't know, but I'm told that that's a lot higher.
That was going to be my next question.
Than it is, I don't know. Maybe that's not a great deal at all, but it's going down to $6 a gram that they're reimbursing veterans for. Okay, it doesn't seem like a big deal. That is saving the government $4.4 billion.
That's remarkable.
That is how much medical marijuana that this government buys for veterans in particular. So there's those kind of savings littered throughout this budget. They're also going to change the way that they index public service pension plans, for example, not necessarily tying the indexation to employees' wages going up, but just to the cost of living, to what inflation actually is. That alone saves nearly $6 billion. So there's cuts beyond the public service cuts, beyond, you know, just letting some bureaucrats go, buying them out. There's other program changes that are coming as well.
Nicholas Zed emailed to ask, based on the budget, what levers are being discussed to improve the unemployment rate?
Yeah, I mean, this is why they have a $51 billion infrastructure package in this budget. They want to get many more infrastructure projects off the ground. And the reason why infrastructure is generally such a great investment, and this has been borne out by other economic downturns, like when we had the Great Recession, the Harper government put a bunch of money into infrastructure. So did Obama in the United States. And that's because there's a lot of knock-on effects from infrastructure spending. So yeah, you get the construction workers, you get them to work, you get the subcontractors to work, you get the people that will eventually run the TTC or, you know, the Toronto Transit Commission or what have you. But also think about all of the other jobs that are associated with building things. You've got accountants, you know, you've got people who work front of house, you've got secretaries in the office, you've got schedulers who are keeping track of when the construction workers should be at their job. You've got people who work in interior design, you have people who work in engineering, you have people who work IT at places that are trying to build things. So there is a lot of indirect jobs that come from infrastructure spending. I think the government says for every $1 invested, it's about $3 or $4 that is coming into the economy as a result, because it's not just about, you know, laying new track between Quebec City and Toronto. It's about all of the things that come about from a project like high-speed rail.
I think that does also raise the question, though, like the quality of the spending matters, that you do get some bang for your buck no matter what, but there's a difference between building, say, a community center and a mine that focuses on critical minerals, or your example of high-speed rail, right? Totally. Some of these have bigger knock-on effects, and also a big part of the Carney government's objective here is this attracting investment, foreign investment in particular, but investment generally, right? They say they think they can bring $1 trillion additional dollars into the economy over time, because some of these projects will be so interesting to folks that they will be willing to spend. The counterbalance there is the uncertainty that Donald Trump has injected into the Canadian economy, and whether that makes these choices seem riskier or not. This is what the government is trying to account for. But, you know, if you're trying to decide, am I going to build a new facility in Canada, and you don't know if Donald Trump is going to upend free trade with Canada during this CUSMA renewal process, are you more reticent? On the other hand, you know, if you're just a small business and you're like, now I can write off all my equipment, I can write off my building, maybe that's enough to make you take the leap. And this is where I think the question is sort of going to fundamentally lie.
I mean, if they build, like, for example, if they build the all-weather, all-season road to the Ring of Fire critical mineral development in Northern Ontario, you know, you'll just see in the budget money for a road. But think about how much economic potential is unlocked if they actually develop that Ring of Fire development, all the critical minerals that are in such hot demand all around the world. If they can get that out and on the roads into markets all around North America and beyond, that's where you start to see how infrastructure spending really translates into a potentially huge boost to the economy. Same for, you know, building port facilities on the West Coast. If they really develop liquefied natural gas and they also, you know, build out these ports, you're sending a lot more valuable product around the world. That's a big boost to the economy.
Indeed. Well, in a similar vein, Ter emailed ask@cbc.ca to say, what Alberta-specific actions have been taken to persuade Alberta to stay in Canada, or is it just another chapter in the Trudeau legacy? I say related because I do think the conversation around infrastructure relates to this. It's not necessarily explicitly like, hey, well, in fact, Danielle Smith has sort of made the case that if she doesn't get a new oil pipeline, that it is bad for Canadian unity. So it's quite explicit in that regard.
Yeah, and I mean, also in this budget, we saw some more details about the Major Projects Office, which will be responsible for approving all the various projects that come forward, a lot of them energy and natural resources. And the budget does mention that the expansion of the liquefied natural gas terminal in Kitimat, BC, the second phase of that, which is the largest private sector project in the history of this country. I think it's $40 billion, $50 billion. they suggested that's going to go ahead. So, I mean, that's liquefied natural gas that, is coming from Alberta, for example, right? And it's going through pipes through BC to the coast. And so that's good news for Danielle Smith if that's what she wants, right? The idea that we were talking about the emissions cap, if that's on, if the emissions cap is on the chopping block, which it seems to be, if other conditions are met, that's certainly positive news for Danielle Smith, who wants to drill, baby, drill, basically, right, in the oil sands and pump more out of there. And every barrel of oil that comes out is more money for the provincial government, more money for the federal government. So she'll be happy with some of the signals that we're getting from Carney on that.
Yes, although that question of the pipeline, I would say, very much remains
Not
unclear
answered.
because
Yeah.
BC, David Evie has been pretty clear. This is not where he thinks the focus should be right now, and it does not seem that the federal government is inclined to
No mention.
to press on that.
No mention of
Lola
that.
on YouTube is asking, are there any more details on the departments expected to be impacted the most in the reduction of public services? Because it is such a long list, Lola, I would recommend our colleagues at cbc.ca/Ottawa actually have, here's what each federal department plans to cut under budget 2025. To that question, though, because I think what people want to know, if you have, say, yourself or a loved one, you're worried about how this will impact your job. It comes back to which programs they're going to cut. The Justice Minister, Sean Fraser, was on yesterday with our colleague David Cochrane on Power and Politics, and David pressed him. Can you give us some examples? Right. They're not ready to go there, and I think the suggestion from the minister was that this is it's an ongoing conversation. I don't think we're going to find out tomorrow either. It's going to take a while to figure out exactly who is affected. Yeah,
they have this thing called the Comprehensive Expenditure Review, in government speak, the CER, and they've been going through every departmental budget to find things that they can cut, places that they can save money, and it does involve, unfortunately, people leaving the public service in some respect. They're trying to do as much of it as they can through attrition. So when someone retires or leaves, just not replacing that job. They're also offering some buyout packages to some public servants. So people who are approaching retirement age or are looking at that in the near future, they're going to be able to get some money from the government basically to go now, and so they can get off the books. And but it's still a substantial cut. It's going from a peak of, I think it was 368,000. They want to whittle that down by about 40,000 jobs to roughly 330,000 public servants. But I'll just say this, there's a reason why they want to make this cut. And that's because, and I'm not justifying it, but I'm just telling you the facts, the public service population has grown far and above faster than population growth over the last number of years. It is not even close. And the population has grown by a lot, as we know. So they've added a tremendous number of public servants over the last number of years, especially under the former Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. And Mark Carney says we can't have program spending growing by 8% a year. It's just not going to work anymore. So he's trying to get the fiscal house in order, but there will be knock-on effects. There will be pain for people, especially here in Ottawa and other places across the country where there are a large number of federal bureaucrats, and it's going to be painful for some people. But I think that Mark Carney has justified it by saying, we can't keep growing like this. We have to get under control. The money pot is not endless, right? Yes, and I think two other things to consider. One is that it's not clear that this is the end of the conversation. If they really want to get to that operational balance we talked about earlier, perhaps there are further cuts coming. Also, that how they do it, I think, matters a lot to the NDP, which matters a lot to potentially getting the votes they need to pass their budget. Again, we talked at the very beginning about this idea of an austerity budget. If it feels too much like austerity, it is hard for the NDP to get behind it. And there are public sector unions, which, typically the NDP has a strong relationship with, who are raising a lot of concerns about this. They work hand in glove often, frankly. IT Sis on TikTok says, how about who lost their jobs and those who lost their jobs because of AI? Any universal income revenue? No, is the answer. This government really is enthusiastic about artificial intelligence. We did a special on the House just a few weeks ago where we did talk about the question of job losses. I think there's an interesting question about the extent to which the government, they are expressing an interest in this. How responsible are they for addressing it? And what will they decide the answer to that is? Right now, we are not in a place where they are having full-throated conversations. We're certainly not talking about universal basic income, for instance, at this point. But I do think it's a conversation that's going to continue as AI pervasiveness wraps up. The minister in charge, Evan Solomon, right now is actually really pressing on the idea that more Canadians need to adopt this. We are something of an AI powerhouse in the world in terms of developing new AI, but our adoption rates aren't actually that impressive compared to
some other countries.
I saw some troubling stats. I don't want to quote the numbers here because I don't have them on hand, but a tremendous number of entry-level white-collar jobs over the next number of years could potentially be eliminated by artificial intelligence. And so that's something the government's going to have to think about for sure. How do you support a tremendous amount of economic dislocation as a result of a technology like this? You know, sometimes you see these figures, they don't always pan out, and we've seen some of the early AI just in how we use it. It's not necessarily great yet, right? Like there's still a lot of flaws with that technology. But it's certainly a concern for workers as we move along.
Well, and it's just one more piece of flux in a time that is, I mean, a lot of this budget, you know, Mark Carney loves that phrase, hinge moment. It is about a time of incredible flux. This is interesting. Vicky L. emailed us to say, I'm a municipal councillor. We can't legally borrow enough money to build over the $70 million infrastructure for all of the new homes we've been mandated to create. Is there any money in the budget that you don't have to apply for going directly to municipalities? Now, you're going to have to apply for anything. Yeah. But there was, I'm just going to pull up my notes from budget day. This Build Community Strong fund has 3 streams. And Vicky, I would tell you, go look word for word in the budget. I am not trying to be the final authority on this by any stretch of the imagination, but the Build Community Strong Fund has 3 streams. One of them is for the provincial and territorial governments to build things like community centers and different kinds of public infrastructure, not just community centers, because I appreciate there's more than that that's required to help with housing. Here we go. Provincial and territorial streams. Which there's a push-pull there, but that's not what you're interested in. There's a direct delivery stream to support regionally significant projects, although that requires private sector investment. There's also a community stream to support local infrastructure. So whether that meets your needs or not, and the nature of the application process, that is more detailed than I can offer today, but I would say it's certainly worth you and the people you work with taking a closer look at the budget and seeing if there's something that's possible there for you.
Yeah, like there's some support for like wastewater management, infrastructure building and stuff like that, which is often costs that are borne by the municipality, right? The federal government is recognizing it's not just about money for developers, that some municipalities need help too if we're going to turbocharge home construction.
Okay, well, I am just looking at another option. We're getting a lot of questions. Thank you to everybody who has sent them in. We got about 5 minutes left. Do economists agree? Steve V on YouTube asks, do economists agree on the growth revenue predictions in the budget? What's the feedback? Well, part of the economic picture that is in the budget is actually, and this is a pretty long-standing process, based on a sample of private sector economists, so that the government can say, and this is not the Liberal government, this is governments, can say, listen, we talk to the big experts. This is what they think is going to happen. They present different scenarios, sort of a best case, medium, and worst case scenario. Our colleague Peter Armstrong, who talks about business probably in his sleep, has mentioned that the downside scenario here is actually not that grim. So sort of their worst case scenario, he feels that's not that far from what we're living right now. And it does sort of beg a question of what if things get worse than they are planning. But it is not just the government coming up with these suggestions. It is based on the work of independent experts.
I mentioned that off the top. I'll just say it again briefly. We're looking at about 2% growth in our economy, GDP growth, 2% last fiscal year. That's what the budget projected. Now we're only looking at about 1%. So they've really, private sector forecasters, economists that work for the big banks in particular, have downgraded how much they think Canada's economy is going to grow because of the trade war. That's a $24 billion hit. And that's what this whole budget is based off of. So they are using those figures from private sector forecasters to build around the numbers. They're not just coming up with their own figures internally. They're relying on outside experts to come up with that data.
Ron D emailed to say, and we talked about this earlier, so I just want to quickly answer Ron's question. I didn't see any mention of the promised RRIF withdrawal reduction. No. What happened? It's not there, Ron. Yep, and it was indeed in the Liberal platform. So I can't explain to you exactly how we got from point A to point B, but the answer is that it's not there.
There was, I'll just say very quickly, the reason why they were proposing that is because stocks were down so dramatically when they pitched that back in April. You'll remember when Trump started the global trade war, the markets cratered. And they really plummeted. And the reason why they had that policy was because they didn't want seniors to have to sell stocks at such a discounted price. They wanted them to be able to hold on to more of them, knowing that there would probably be a recovery. And so now that the markets are at record highs, both in Canada and the United States, there's less concern about people selling out right now, and so I think that's probably why they've dialed that back. That's just a guess, but I think that would be a good guess.
Nicholas Zed has another question for us. Based on your understanding of the budget, what do you anticipate the amendments will be from the other parties? Now, I don't know exactly what they're going to be, but it might kind of be a good moment to talk about the politics of all this, because also it's a little inside baseball, but the Conservatives missed the opportunity to be the lead on the amendments yesterday, which means the Bloc is going to go first. And, this is not a crystal ball, but I'm going to say something about Quebec, or something that is of interest to Quebec. For instance, the Bloc has put a real emphasis on benefits for seniors, because a lot of their voting base are senior citizens, and by expanding it beyond just an issue that's of interest to Quebec, there is a sort of smart politics there of trying to draw the government in. You might recall that this was actually a real point of tension with the Trudeau Liberals, right, where the Bloc were trying to insist that they wanted an increase for a certain subsection of senior citizens to their guaranteed income supplement. We are just about done here, JP.
Really? Already? We could keep going.
Thank you very much for taking the time to have this conversation. Thank you to everybody who sent in their questions about the budget. It is not small, and so there's a lot of ground to cover. If we didn't get to your question, we're sorry, but there is a ton of information on cbcnews.ca, great articles by JP and the rest of our colleagues, give people a bit of a better sense as we all try to digest this and make sense of it. Thank you for taking the time, JP. If people want to check out your work, where should they look?
cbcnews.ca. Thanks so much for having me, Catherine. This was fun.
It was fun. And anybody who needs a bit of a political fix, we are certainly going to be talking about the budget on the House. New episodes drop Saturday, wherever you get your podcasts. I will also be hosting, I'm not her, but I'll be hosting Rosemary Barton Live this Sunday. I'm going to be having a conversation with the finance minister about this new budget. Tune in, check it out.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.